and let's go on this ride and journey together. Okay. Okay. Let's start with questions people have. And these aren't just like dumb questions like what's an e-bike and you know how do you ride one. I'm not talking about stupid things like that. I'm talking about like legitimate questions that people have. One of the first questions I get all the time, especially when talking about like fast bikes that I ride, is can you ride them in the street without a license? And it kind of comes down to a lot of things, people. Some bikes like the Spark Psychoworks Bandit, one of the only ones that I know about, has an actual VIN number and you can get it registered. So I would do that if I were you. I would get it registered, get a license plate on it. You can ride it anywhere you want. Then you have the Surons that everybody rides, right? Or the Segway X160s. And everybody wants to know if you can register those. If you go on the Luna Cycle website, the guy talks about how you can register them, but I've never seen somebody with a registered Suron. So I don't know. And keep in mind that registering it would only enable you to ride it on the street. A lot of people ride them off-road, and having a license plate isn't going to help you off-road. So bottom line is that every state has different rules, and it's kind of ridiculous. But you got to kind of look at your own state's laws and see what they say. But for the most part, a good rule of thumb is if you get a fast e-bike like my Cab Motorworks Eagle that goes 50, or the Surons, or you know, the Rumble Motors has a bunch, or the Cake bikes, or the you know, any of those kinds of bikes, you're not gonna probably register it. It's just not gonna happen, you know. So keep in mind that, you know, if it doesn't have pedals, you might run into some issues. For those that saw that video of me getting pulled over by the cops on that park trail, I was with 4 Surons, and they said I was the only one that could go without a ticket if I wanted to, because I had pedals that worked and actually propelled my bike. So, you know, in terms of can you ride it without a license, most likely not, but people do anyway. I do all the time. I go on rides in LA all the time with people on Surons. They never get pulled over. So it's kind of a rolling of the dice, you know what I mean? But could you get it registered? Maybe. Some states might allow you to, but typically they want to know what your VIN number is. They want to know how many cc's your motor is, because they're still not used to electric bikes. So anyway, that's one of the questions you get. The next one you get is, I have a 36 volt, you know, 8 amp hour battery. Is it worth getting a 36 volt 12 amp hour battery? Or I have a 48 volt 14 amp hour battery. Should I get a 52 volt 6 amp hour battery? All that really matters, people, is the watt hours. So take your amp hours, you know, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 20, whatever the number of amp hours, and multiply it by the watt, or the voltage of the battery. 36 volt, 48 volt, 60 volt, 72 volt, 84 volt. And whatever watt hours you come up with will tell you if it's worth it. I can tell you, and I know I'm going to get a lot of bullshit for this, but I don't give a shit. The average 100 watt hours is going to give you like 2.5 miles. So if you have like a 600 amp hour battery, you might get 12, 14, 15. It depends. Yeah, you might be able to get 18 if you're really light and you pedal a lot. But I mean, on average, right? So, you know, 2.5, 3 hours, or 3 miles for every 100 watt hours. So, for example, the Super 73 has 900 watt hours. It gets, on throttle only, about 25 miles, right? So 2.5 times. And there's just tons of bikes that, you know, that's kind of my rule of thumb. You probably will never find that anywhere else, but bottom line is, if you have a 36 volt, you know, 10 amp hour battery, that's 360 watt hours. If you have a 36 amp 12 amp hour battery, excuse me, yeah, 36 volt 12 amp hour battery, you figure out the math. But I don't know, it's an extra 72 volts, whatever it is, or 72 watt hours, whatever it is. No, it's not. You know what I'm saying, people. It's an extra 2, yeah, exactly. It's an extra 2 watt hours. So it takes 36, you had 36 times 10, and then you have 36 times 12. It's just 2 more amp hours. So 36 times 2 is 76, whatever it is, 72 watt hours. 72 watt hours is going to give you maybe 1.5 miles, maybe 2 miles, depending on the bike. So is it worth it? I don't know, but that's how you know. Okay, voltage of the battery times amp hours will give you watt hours, and that way you'll know, right? I'm not saying you can't ask me questions, people. Everybody can ask me questions, I don't care, but I'm just giving you like some rules of thumb, you know. I think people really benefit from rules of thumb. Okay, then people ask, people are really stuck on the wattage of the motor. And the wattage of the motor gives you one good indication, right? 1,000 watt motor versus a 500 watt motor, big difference. But what really matters, that's the nominal wattage of the battery, meaning it's rated for that, you know, the nominal state, right? It's normal state where you're cruising and you're, you know, whatever. But then every motor has a max wattage, right? So it could have a 500 watt motor, could have a 500 watt nominal, 750 watt or peak, 750 peak or max, right? So what really matters, and a lot of companies will give you the max. So let me give you an example. There's a company called Velotrick, and they have this Discover One, and it has a 500 watt motor, right? And you look at a lot of bikes out there that have 750, and you're like, oh, it's so much, it's not as good as like one of those bikes. Well, to give you an example, the Red Power bikes have, let's say, a 750 watt motor, but it peaks at 750 watts. It doesn't go any higher. And I know that because they have the voltage or the watt readout on the little display. So a 750 watt motor with a 750 watt peak is going to give you 750 watt peak. But this 500 watt motor for Velotrick Discover One has a 900 watt peak. See the difference there? So a 500 watt motor with 900 peak is a hell of a lot better than a 750 watt motor with 750 peak, right? So you got to kind of figure out what the peak is. And sometimes they're not going to list it on the website, but you can always ask a manufacturer, email them. Hey, I'm looking at your XYZ bike and it says you have a 750 watt motor. What's the peak? Because I'll give you another example. Again, 750 watt motor for some of these bikes, the Rad Rover, struggling to come up with another one, but there are a bunch that have 750 watt motors. And they peak at 750 watt, maybe 775 watts, right? But the Velotrick Discover Nomad one has a 750 watt motor with an 1100 watt peak, okay? Then, I don't know how this is even possible, but you got these Pedigo bikes, right? Like a Pedigo, it's like their $1,500-$1,800 bike. Pedigo Element, I think it's what it's called. And it has a 500 watt motor, as does their like their Ridge Rider and all these others. They have 500 watt motors, but they peak at like 12 or 1500 watts. And it's true, because when you ride it, you're like, Jesus Christ, this is not a 500 watt motor. So really what matters is the max. And don't be afraid to ask your manufacturer what the max is, okay? Is there a power difference between a 36 volt, a 48 volt, a 52 volt, and a 72 volt? I mean, not really. It really comes down to the controller, the motor, and the battery, and how many amps it can put out. How many amps can the controller put out that won't screw up the battery, like burn out the battery or screw up the motor? So collectively, it's all about how many amps the controller can put out and how much the battery and the motor can handle. There are a lot of manufacturers that sell very popular bikes, but the bikes themselves aren't the best quality. And I'm not going to go through the different manufacturers, but you know, if you're not sure, you know, send me a note on, or a message or comment on my Facebook or on my Instagram, _frickin_shredder. And I'll answer. I know about quite a few of the different manufacturers. Another thing people ask about is, you know, do I really need suspension? I've ridden tons of bikes that have no suspension, and I've ridden tons of bikes that have just front suspension. I've ridden some bikes that just have rear suspension, and I've ridden a bunch of bikes that have full suspension. Let me give you some examples. The Rad Mission, for example, the Rad Runner doesn't have any suspension, but you're probably not going to ever ride those really off-road. So you're just riding on the street, and does it really matter? Not really. And you could always take one of those bikes and lower the tire pressure instead of like 35, which is maybe recommended. Put it at 20, you'll get a little bounce, you know. Or you could get one of those, you know, D&M, or they have these $35 little suspension seat posts that you could get. It gives you some bounce. Then tons of bikes that have front suspension. Could literally name like 100, but you know, the Himalaya bikes, the Rad Power bikes, a lot of the Super 73s, like the Super 73 S2, the Super 73 S1, the Super 73 Z1, Super 73 ZX. There are tons of bikes. A lot of bikes have just front suspension, right? Then there are a bunch of bikes that have just rear suspension. They're really small usually, but it's like the Swagtron EB7 Pluses of the world. You know, those small little bikes that just have like a little rear spring, right? A spring suspension. It's going to help you a lot, and it's all about where the center of the gravity of the bike is. If you have some bikes, for whatever reason, like this bike, you feel it in the seat, and so you'd want to have rear suspension. Front suspension helps, but it's not imperative. Some bikes, you feel it in the handlebars, and if you don't have like front suspension, you're going to be really feeling it. So what's interesting though is like the EB7 Plus from Swagtron. It's that orange one. It has a rear suspension, which is interesting. When you ride it, you really don't feel anything in the handlebars, but you do feel it in the seat, and that's where that suspension really comes into play. So they designed that bike right. And then you have a lot of bikes that have full suspension. They're obviously more expensive. Typically those bikes are in the 1800 to 2000 and up range. You know, most off-road bikes, the Surons, the Segways, the higher end Super 73s, Area Rider, you know, the Grizzly, the Juice Typer Scrambler, you know, those are like the higher end bikes, 3000 to 2800, 2500, whatever. And they have fat tires as well. And with full suspension, even if you don't have fat tires, you can definitely go off-road as long as your tires have some level of tread. You don't need full knobbiness, okay? You don't. A lot of people think you need full knobbies like these tires in front of me to go off-road. You don't. As long as your tires have some level of tread, like some, you know, marks in the tires, they're not slicks. You can do a little fire road or a little path on at a park. You're not gonna have a problem, you know. But you're not gonna be going off-road unless you have like some decent-sized knobbies. What else do people say? Just trying to think for a second here. A lot of people think like 30 miles an hour, for example. A lot of bikes peak at 30 miles an hour. A lot of people think that's just not fast enough. I need 50. Well, it's like if you're gonna be going in the bike lane, most people ride in the bike lane with an e-bike, and you're gonna be going 50 miles an hour, you're gonna have some serious problems because you're gonna pass joggers, you're gonna pass cyclists and cops. So unless you're really gonna be going like bombing through the you know, in group rides through like LA or New York City, and you're gonna be going really fast, or you're gonna be going you know, back roads in the middle of nowhere, you're not gonna be going faster than 30 miles an hour anyway, right? This bike goes 50. You know how many times I've gone 50? Maybe twice. You know, I never go 50. What am I gonna do with 50? So 30 miles an hour is actually really good, you know. The other thing is, people ask, you know, how durable or how good is a folding bike? And you don't have to worry about like the integrity. No, you don't. Most folding bikes are freaking rock solid. They build that hinge really well, and it just locks the bike, you know, and it's not going anywhere. So I've really never really ridden a folding bike that, like, you know, is rickety at the point of the connection between the, you know, where the fold is. they're all pretty freaking solid, people, so don't worry about it, you know. It's kind of like they make kayaks that can break in half, and then you like there's a connection point that puts them together. Well, that might have issues because of the water leakage, right? That's a big problem potentially. But these are e-bikes, and the folding mechanisms really don't make a difference. You're gonna have a really solid bike if you get a folding bike. I wouldn't worry about it. Then the other questions I get a lot are, you know, do I need fat tires versus skinny tires? Some e-bikes have like, you know, 1.5 to 2 inch wide tires. Some of them have 2.5 inch tires. You've got some that have like 3 inch wide tires, like this bike I'm riding. Look down there. That's a 3 inch wide tire. And then you've got those fat tire bikes. You know, the Area Riders, the Juice, the Super 73s, all those kinds of bikes. They have a fat 4 inch wide tire. The difference between a narrow tire and a fat tire is like two things. One, you're not going to you have more rolling resistance, obviously, if you have more touch on the ground with the tires. So 4 inch wide tires, you know, you got to probably have them pumped up pretty good. Or, you know, you're not going to really be able to pedal. It's hard to pedal a fat tire bike because you have a lot of rolling resistance. If it's got a decent sized motor and battery, you're fine. But if you're trying to pedal one of those bikes, it's tough because there's a lot of rolling resistance. Those tires are heavy, the inner tubes are heavy, and it's just got a lot of impact with a lot of, you know, contact with the ground. Cool thing though about those fat tire bikes, if you put the PSI down to like 10 or 15, then you get some bounce from them, you know what I mean? So you almost don't even need suspension. So that's the cool thing about fat tires. The narrower tires just give you a little bit more speed, typically a little bit more carving capability. I've had a bunch of fat tire bikes, and they're a blast, but you don't have the most incredible carving capability because the tires are kind of big. You know, it's kind of a big lug to kind of carve. It's not like nimble, you know what I mean? Like imagine riding a mountain bike versus a bike like this, a bike like a Super 73 that has this big wide tires. Mountain bike, you can just, you know, you're not gonna be riding huge fat tires on Whistler in Canada, you know, that huge trail. You're not. That downhill trail. You're not gonna have the kind of carving capability. So that's kind of the difference there. The other thing is to consider is inner tubes and pumps. The inner tubes for a fat tire bike are much heavier, take much more air, and they're much more expensive. You can get like a pretty narrow tire inner tube for like $5-7 bucks. An inner tube for a fat tire bike costs you $15-20 bucks. The other thing is you're not using a CO2 cartridge to pump up your in one of those little pumps that you attach to the stem of your valve of your inner tube. You're not using one of those to pump up a fat tire bike. There's just no way. You would need literally 10 or 15 of those freaking little CO2s. You also have those battery operated, like they look like the size of like they're about this long and like this wide, and they're kind of thick, and they have battery, and they're battery operated pump. It would take you like 10 minutes to pump up one tire with one of those. So fat tires, they take so much more air, you know, as where with the other ones, the other narrower tires, it doesn't take that long. And yeah, in some cases you could actually use one of those CO2s. So that's kind of the difference there. The other thing I get a lot of flack for, it's not really a question, but is like running stop signs. When you're on group rides, it's never okay. But when you're on a group ride with 200 people, like on the Halloween ride I was on recently, and every single person is running the red light but you aren't, it causes problems. I'll give you an example. We were running a red light, and there was a cop right there in the opposite corner, and so I stopped right there on the ride. And people that were coming through like start yelling at me because they were like zipping by me, like, oh my god, you can't stop. So it's like you got to do what everybody else is doing or you're going to cause problems. So but for the most part, when you're riding an electric bike, you want to kind of obey the rules of the road, and don't go in crosswalks. Get in the actual car lane when you're going through an intersection or you're turning. Get in the left, you know, turn lane, and be a car and act like a car. And you know, use your hand if you don't have, you know, blinkers, right? So anyway, that's kind of the questions that you get, the complaints that you get. There are all kinds of complaints. I'm going to turn around. Excuse me. There are all kinds of complaints you get on e-bikes. from people that are looking to buy an e-bike, and a lot of it is the manufacturers and their customer service. You got to understand a couple things. A lot of these manufacturers are small companies that are just, ordering tons of bikes from China. They've got a few assemblers that are throwing on the different parts and the motors and the batteries, and they're just cranking them out. And they're more concerned about sales than they are about customer service. I'm not going to mention any names, but some of the biggest ones you've heard of, that's the case, right? One of the companies that I know, not going to mention, it really has like 2 people, and getting support is challenging, right? Then you've got some of the bigger companies that are starting to put more people in place, but they still don't have enough, and it can take weeks to get answers and weeks to get parts, and just a pain in the ass. So look on Reddit, look on Facebook. There's tons of groups for every manufacturer, like electric group or a Segway e-bikes group, or an aerial rider group or a Surron group, and ask the question, how good's the customer service from that manufacturer, and then you'll know. Okay, that's the best way to find out. Other complaints you get is the bike comes out of the box, and if it has gears and you can pedal it, and the derailleur is grinding, well, what you do, it really comes down to kind of, for the most part, the brake pads on the rotors, because the brake pads are rubbing on the rotors. So flip the bike over, you loosen the mechanism that holds the brakes in place, that holds the brake caliper against the frame of the bike, and you just juggle the brake. You just juggle the brakes a little bit on the frame, like a teeny bit, like 1/8 of a millimeter one way or the other way, and try to get there to be a visible gap on both sides of that brake pad. Brake pad sits in the middle, and you got 2 calipers on either side of it. You want to make sure that the rotor of the bike sits in between those brake pads without any kind of like rubbing on either side. You want to get a dead center, and that's how you do that. So a lot of times bikes will be aligned perfectly from the manufacturer, but then when it gets jostled around in the box, it comes to you and it's not. So just sometimes you have to do that. There's a bunch of people on the internet that can show you how to do that. So just go on YouTube and type in, how do you align the brakes on an e-bike, for example. It's not hard, people. I'm not a freaking tech guy, and I figured it out. Something else you get a lot is complaint is that I bought a really fast e-bike, and it came with pedals, and I wanted pegs. Keep in mind a couple things. Pegs are a lot sturdier, like motorcycle pegs. When you're going around turns with pegs, you can kind of lean and really dig it. If you're going to the left, you lean to the right and dig in with your left and really get good traction with pegs. Pedals, it's not as easy. It is harder. I'm riding this thing with pedals, and it's harder. But at the same time, remember, cops, they like pedals. Cops love pedals. So just keep that in mind, that if you have a bike with pedals, it might not be a bad idea. You know what I mean? Some of these bikes, like the Rumble Motors Apex that just came out, or that's coming out, it's freaking huge. It's a mountain of a bike. It's a freaking motorcycle, right? Or they've got like these other huge ones. I don't know what it's called, like the S2 or something. And it's just massive. And it's like, really? It's a motorcycle. The cops are gonna pull you over. But at least if you had pedals, it's helpful, right? At least you have some kind of leg to stand on, if you will. Other complaints are the controller. A lot of bikes, okay, so a lot of bikes will come with a 500 watts, 750 watts, 1000 watt, and you're like, man, I thought this bike would be faster. And a lot of times you can keep the same motor. A lot of times you can even keep the same battery, but you can get a better controller, right? Look up controllers from Saviton, ASI. They make the BAC 4000, 8000. Those are some kind of high-powered controllers, but there's even some cheaper ones on like Alibaba or even Amazon, controllers that are like $75, and they put out more amps, right? So you could have a bike with a 500-watt motor that's putting out like 30 amps, but let's say that the motor and the battery can handle 75 amps. You just need a controller that can put out more amps, and you can kind of keep the same. Sometimes you do have to upgrade the battery more so than the motor, but a lot of these motors can put out way more amps than they're doing. And the reason that they don't is because the manufacturers don't want to have like people blowing the systems and have to deal with them and get, you know, they'd rather just play it safe and just kind of put out modest amounts of power. I think that's what Super 73 was doing. I can't guarantee, but I think with their torque update, I think all they were doing was doing an electronic update where the controller would put out more amps. That's the only way they could do it, right? It's electronic. So a lot of times, you know, your bike can be faster if you're willing to put a new controller on it, but you got to make sure that the controller is rated for the motor and the battery, right? You know what I get sometimes, and it's just like bullshit, is when some asshole comes on my channel and goes, "You don't know anything." Well, it's like I'm basing everything on the 81 bikes e-bikes that I've ridden. I've ridden 81 e-bikes, and I've owned more than 15, right? And I've owned 11 motorcycles. So it's like, sometimes I don't use maybe the exact technical terminology, but trust me, everything I'm telling you is accurate, okay? And if you don't think it isn't, if you don't think it is, then go, whatever, pound salt. I wanted to say something way worse. But anyway, so you can trust me, people. What else? Other complaints people have. The price. If you look at some bikes, most bikes come from China, e-bikes, and it's a frame, and it might have the brakes, or it might not. It might have the motor, it might not. It might have the battery, it might not. And a lot of these manufacturers in the US, they call themselves manufacturers, but really they're just assemblers. And they just put their own battery on it that they got from, you know, somewhere, their own motor, and then maybe different, you know, brakes and whatnot. And all they do is just source the parts from like overseas or from like, you know, Amazon, like you would, and they call it their bike, and they put their own little styling on it and their stickers. So it's like, a lot of times you can get the exact same bike with just different accoutrements. Let me give you a couple examples. The Himaway Cruiser, the Rad Rover 5, and this, I'm getting ready to check it out, the Velotric Nomad 1. Those are just three of the exact same bike, you know. Might just have a different manufacturer's battery, different manufacturer's motor, but for the most part, everything is identical, right down to the lights, right down to the fenders and the metal bars that hold the fenders on. So a lot of bikes, if you don't like the price, keep looking, and you might find basically the same bike, but just from a different brand, you know. A lot of people don't realize that, but it's true. Something else that I get asked sometimes is, what kind of helmet do I need? Well, helmets come in various, you know, different kinds. You got like the skateboard helmet. It's like really smooth. It comes from the back of your neck all the way over to your top of your head. It's got no visor, but it's like a one solid piece. Then you've got the bicycle helmets. You know, they've got like the gaps and the ridges above, and it's like really aerodynamic, and it's got good airflow. And then you have, you know, the full face ones, which is actually what I'm wearing right now. Like the from Fox and Troy Lee Designs, and they're like BMX helmets, right, that have like the chin part. If you're gonna be riding an e-bike that's over 30 miles an hour, and you're gonna be going off-road especially, get a freaking face helmet, you know, one, right? It makes sense. I've been in some wrecks on my Super 73, for example. I only went like 30 miles an hour, 29 miles an hour, and if I didn't have the full face mask, I'd be screwed right now, you know. So that's something to think about. Another thing I get asked is, and this is kind of a dumb one, but I mean, people ask questions and it's fine. Do I need two mirrors? No, you don't. how often do you need a left mirror? Oh, excuse me, a right mirror. You know what I mean? Do you really need to know what's going on the sidewalk? Typically, unless you're riding in the street on like group rides, you're gonna be riding in the right lane, and you're gonna be riding in the bike lane. So you don't really need to know what's going on to the right, right? So for the most part, all you need is a left mirror. If you're gonna be going off road, you probably want to take your mirrors off anyway, because they're gonna get bent and screwed up and probably like flop left, flop right, and they're gonna just have problems.